Alrighty, in property, this week we finished our discussion on adverse possession, and this is going to be a little bit of a scrambled episode, mostly just because there's a lot to do with adverse possession, and we listed out the elements, but there's a whole lot of other rules that are associated with it. As a result, this episode's going to be a bit scrambled. Ultimately, my goal is to really finish off adverse possession for real property, and finish off the rules for adverse possession of real property, and then talk about adverse possession for personal property and the difference between the two. After I finish the discussion on real property, I'll explain the difference between real and personal, and then ultimately use that to transition into the rules for adverse possession for personal property. So finishing up this adverse possession for real property, and real property is land, and that's what we've been talking about, and the elements that are associated with adverse possession of land that we have been talking about thus far. Those elements are: possession needs to be actual, exclusive, open and notorious, continuous, and obviously it needs to be adverse or hostile. So those are the elements that we talked about. Our first case that we actually brought up to introduce some new rules is Howard versus Kunto. And what happened here is that the Kuntos had purchased a summer home next to a canal, and they had the land surveyed, but things were 50 feet off. Everybody was shifted over a lot, one to the side. And so the Moyers are trying to, were on this land, the Howard's land, and the Moyers told the Howards, hey, you can go ahead and sue Kunto for what we would normally be doing ourselves. And so that's why this case is Howard versus Kunto. And so Howard's trying to get Kunto's land. Kunto's land is 50 feet to the left or to the right. It's really just to the west. Kunto's land is 50 feet to the west. They're sitting on Howard's land, and that's described in their deed. And ultimately, it's like, okay, we're trying to get this all figured out. So what do you do in this situation? Well, the rule is a purchaser may tack the adverse use of a predecessor's previous interest to their own current interest with the land. And so there's ultimately, let me try and explain that better than what I had said. So adverse possession, you can tack time on. So the Kuntos had lived in this house for 1 year. Adverse possession is typically 10 years long, and the previous owners had lived on this land for over 10 years. So the Kuntos, according to this rule, are allowed to tack time onto the land so that they can actually claim adverse possession, because even though they didn't have it themselves for the full 10 years. There is a caveat in this, though, and what that is that there needs to be privity between this transition of property. And so, because the original person is a trespasser, but they obtained that property through adverse possession, and then they sell that, well, then there's privity between these two people, and you can tack. If you're lacking this privity, then you're not able to tack. So privity, just to define it, is a reasonable connection of successive occupation of the property, meaning that you've got to be closely associated with someone. Being a friend isn't enough to establish privity. A family member could be enough to establish privity. A purchase is definitely enough to establish privity. So that's the rule from Howard versus Kunto. That is, adverse possession, time can be tacked if you don't mean it yourself, but there needs to be privity between those. One trespasser can't tack on to another trespasser that has no reasonable connection. That's a big takeaway from that case. Another rule that we need to note is disability. There's two options for disability. The first option, and this is the default option, is that adverse possession, the time starts ticking. So if you live in a place and for 10 years and somebody has a disability, well, then that time doesn't start ticking until that disability ends. That's the rule. So what are we defining as a disability? There's three things. It's if they're a minor, if they lack mental capacity to do something, or if they're in prison. So let's say a minor, for example. A minor is 2 years old, and the person starts possessing the home, possessing some of the land, and it's this minor's land. It was either through inheritance, or actually it's probably definitely through inheritance. But this minor's land at 2 years old. The statute of limitations is 20 years long. What the standard rule is, the default rule, is that time doesn't start going until that minor is 18 years old. So if the person with disability started living on the land when the minor was 5 years old, possessed it up until 18, that's not enough. They have to actually start tacking it on, adding the time once the minor has hit 18 years old. So they would have to be there from 5 to 18 years old, and then that person would have to be there for the rest of the time until the statute of limitations has been met. The other way to do this is that there's a limited amount of time that the person has to claim, meaning the person with the disability has to claim after the disability ends. So say, for example, the person had met all the person trying to claim adverse possession has met all the requirements for the period of time, except for this person has a disability, so they can't claim it. Once the person exits the disability, well, then say the rule is 5 years. The person who previously had the disability then has 5 years to kick the other person off the land. So ultimately, it's going to be a shorter time frame window that the adverse possession has to actually occur. This is kind of the minor approach, but it still is used in some jurisdictions. There are a couple of rules that we need to know. Disability must exist at the beginning of the possession period, meaning once the person has started possession, the person has to have already had the disability in order for these rules to apply. Second, death ends all disabilities. Third, disabilities are not allowed to be tacked, so you can't pass one disability. One person who's disabled passes on, and then the second person who's inherited the land. That doesn't start the whole process over again. And fourth, disability does not shorten the statutory time requirements. So that means if the disability statute says, 5 years after it ends, but the statute of limitations requirement for adverse possession is 10 years, well, if the person's disability ends immediately at 5 years, well, then that doesn't mean that the adverse possession is now 5 years instead of 10. 10 years is still going to be the rule there. And then on one separate note, one last rule before getting into personal property is that you can't adversely possess land that is owned by the local, state, or federal government. I think that's pretty straightforward. Totally makes sense. All right, let's talk about the adverse possession of chattels. So a chattel is an object or an item that people own. It's personal property. What's the difference between personal property and real property? Well, real property is land, and anything attached to that land, like a house, or a well, things like that. And personal property are things that are movable. So a dog, a pet, my computer, those are all examples of personal property. Now we have a couple of rules with personal property. Ultimately, they are slightly different rules. The adverse possession period is quite often much shorter for personal property than it is for real property, where real property has time periods that range from like 10 to 25 years. Personal property tends to go between 2 to 6 years. Let's quickly just go over the cases. We've got Reynolds versus Bagwell. What happened in this case is that the plaintiff was the person who owned the violin. The violin was stolen from him and then sold to the current owner. Later, the plaintiff discovered that the violin was was possessed by the later owner and ultimately wanted to get it back. The court said, no, you can't do this because by this point it already passed 3 years. And because the time had passed 3 years, which was beyond the statutory period of 2 years, well, the statute of limitations has run and you can't bring forth this claim. The only exception to this is if it was concealed. And so what the professor argued here is that, well, it was concealed because he changed the appearance. The varnish is gone. And the issue that happens with this, though, is that varnishment, that concealment occurred after the 3-year period. So ultimately, our rule that we obtained from this analysis is that if personal property is lost, stolen, whatever it might be, well, then the new owner can adversely possess that property, take new ownership of that property, if they meet all the elements of adverse possession, including the statutory time period, and there is no element of concealment, meaning they didn't try and hide or disfigure the item in any way. And that really goes up into the open and notorious part of the elements. Good faith is mentioned in this, meaning that the buyer was a good faith buyer, but it ultimately doesn't really change the analysis that we have here. Our second case was O'Keefe versus Snyder. What happened in this case is that paintings were stolen, and she failed to report the paintings, and ultimately she discovered the paintings later in a different gallery and claimed that these paintings were hers. And so can she reclaim these paintings some 30 or so years after this? Well, the argument here was that no, she can't because the statute of limitations has already run, being a 6-year period. But ultimately, what the court decides is that they adopt the discovery rule. What the discovery rule is the statute of limitations time doesn't start unless the person has discovered or they've had a reasonable opportunity to discover the items that were missing or stolen or lost. So what that means is if she didn't put forth a good effort, well, then the statute of limitations would have run. But she did put forth a good effort, and this is something for the trial court to determine, well, then the discovery rule would come into effect, and she would have 6 years after that to actually state her cause of action. That is the discovery rule. That's how adverse possession works for real property. Just to refresh everything, so for real property, adverse possession elements include that it needs to be open and notorious, adverse and hostile, actual possession, exclusive possession, and then I'm missing one. And continuous possession. Those are the elements for real property. Some states add more elements. Ultimately, those are the things that are at issue. A couple of other things to mention are good faith. Bad faith plays a significant role as well. A lot of the time it doesn't matter. You can tack those on. We talked about disabilities. Adverse possession of public property isn't a good thing. And then we talked about adverse possession of personal property, which tends to have a shorter statutory period. The purpose of that, which I didn't mention, is really to increase market flow. And all those things kind of work together to determine these rules. So adverse possession is something that can be pretty complicated. There's a lot of rules to go with it. And it's something I feel comfortable with but have misgivings about as far as a principle that we should follow. That's adverse possession. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Law Schoolers. Before I let you go, there are 4 things I want to say. The first thing is if you enjoyed these episodes and if you enjoyed the website, I would invite you to go and join Law Schoolers Pro. And you can do that by going to lawschoolers.com/join. It's a way for you to support us, but there's also a lot of features there that I think you will enjoy. Second thing is that nearly all of our episodes are unedited. The only ones that aren't are pre-law materials, and the reason for that is so you can actually see the legal material in its raw form as I'm learning it as well. The third thing is that the information contained in these episodes are specifically only for educational purposes. They're not to be used as legal advice, and with that, the fourth thing is if it is used as legal advice, we are not liable. That is, Law Schoolers is not liable for any legal outcomes. Thank you again for enjoying the show. Have a good one.